To everyone joining, we're just going to give it a few more minutes to allow people to come in, and then we will begin the final session of the day. Thank you for holding tight. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final session of day 3 of Rethinking Economics for Africa. Hopefully, you've been with us since the festival began 3 days ago. Today's day 3, and unfortunately, it means that the festival is coming to a close. It's been fabulously enriching, extremely lively, a lot of thought-provoking discussions. As usual, one of those things where at the end of it, you are left with more questions than you are answers, but also with the confidence that there are some really brilliant and bright people who are thinking about them very seriously. And hopefully in the coming months, as the world confronts the very, very serious question of what is going to happen next after this god-awful pandemic, if it ends at all, we can all work together to try and implement solutions in the world and indeed rethink not only economics, but everything. And so I'm very happy to be part of this session, which is exactly about rethinking. Today's session is about wondering about how do we get towards a post-COVID-19 society. We have some really brilliant panelists that are here for you today, who I will introduce in a second, but to mention their names, they are Zama Mthunzi, Amuzweni, Ngoma, as well as Fatima, Hassan. And we are going to, I think, have a really enlivening session this evening. And I hope everyone is looking forward to it. But before we get to the actual meat of it, must as always just mention a few housekeeping rules. First of all, thank you to everyone who's in attendance for making the time. In Joburg, it's a fine afternoon, but I'm aware that other parts of the country are experiencing some miserable weather. So congrats to you, especially if you are here in spite of that. And please, as we engage tonight, can we all just practice a level of decorum? Can we be respectful in our comments, avoid anything that is inflammatory or anything that expresses bigotry? And if we are going to disagree with each other, which I do encourage, let's do so in a comradely manner. And so if you would like to mention any comments or express any opinions or remarks, the best place to do that is the chat function And if you would like to ask a question to our panelists, the best place to do that is through the Q&A function. If you look at the bottom of your screen, that should be where the speech bubbles are for the Q&A, the two speech bubbles, and then the single speech bubble for the chat function. So with those housekeeping rules out of the way, let's begin our session, which tonight is exploring the question of how do we get towards a post-COVID-19 society. So as all of us are aware, this pandemic has been horrible. It's been devastating. It's claimed an enormous loss of life. And unfortunately, the tragedy is still ongoing. However, in some parts of the world, it looks like some degree of normality is returning. Economic recovery is starting to build in parts of the world. Lockdown restrictions are starting to be relaxed. And there is some degree of things getting back to where they were before the pandemic. At the same time, however, the very problem is the fact that a lot of things that characterized the world before the pandemic still persist. And so we are seeing an unequal recovery in which some countries are better able to protect and inoculate their populations and ensure recovery, whilst others aren't. And so the point of this session is to answer and explore for us in Africa, how do we envision a post-COVID-19 recovery? Notwithstanding the fact that COVID-19 is by itself a devastating and troubling crisis, as many people have said throughout this entire period, it's also exacerbated some deeper and underlying crises, such as the social and economic crises, which has been plaguing us since 2008, as well as the ecological crises, which is worsening as the days go by. So when it comes to confronting these problems, how do we want to do them? On what terms do we want to do them? What sort of economies do we want to build? What sort of communities do we want to build? I think that it is apt that yesterday, the economic historian Adam Tooze wrote an article for the New York Times asking the question, what if the coronavirus crisis is just a trial, alluding to the fact that in many ways we are entering a period of history where we are going to see more pandemics, where we are going to see more environmental destruction, where we are going to see more disruption. And if the COVID-19 pandemic is a dress rehearsal for a world that is slowly decaying, the verdict is that we haven't really done so well. So how do we think about how to do better? And I think that the concluding paragraph of the article written by Tooze poses the exact kind of framework for how we think about it. And Tooze writes that the challenge for a progressive globalism fit for the next decade is both to multiply those crisis-fighting networks into the fields of medical research and vaccine development, renewable energy, and so on, and to make them more democratic, transparent, and egalitarian. So to think about how exactly to do that, I don't have the answers. Fortunately, I'm joined by three brilliant people who will have a lot more to say and who might have some answers, or at least ask the right questions. And so I'm so honored to be joined by Mr. Zama Mthunzi, Ms. Amuzweni Ngoma, as well as Ms. Fatima Hassan. And each of them is going to be talking to one theme that has to do with rethinking the world that we are entering after COVID. Mr. Mthunzi is going to be talking about youth unemployment and the challenge facing young people. Ms. Ngoma is going to be talking about the challenge of how we re-socialize in a post-COVID world. And Ms. Hassan will talk about how we can overcome inequalities, which are acutely coming to the fore in the vaccine apartheid, which plagues the world today. So each speaker will have 15 minutes to speak. After they've spoken, we are going to have a Q&A session, which will hopefully last as long as it can, and we will end the session at 7. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker for this evening, who is Mr. Zama Mthunzi. Zama is a mathematical science graduate from Wits University. He's an education activist, and he's recognized among the Mail and Guardian top 200 under the category of education in 2020. He's published prolifically over the last year. You can check out some of his writing on Thought Catalog, on Thought Leader, as well as Africa as a Country. I'll be sharing some of that in the chat as he speaks, so you can see some of his work after this ends. And so I'm very happy to welcome Mr. Mthunzi to the stage. Zama, over to you to kick things off.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, William. Thank you for carrying us. I just want to greet fellow participants and also the panelists who have joined us for this conversation. A very tricky conversation that we're having today. It's about reimagining and trying to see how can we move from where we are to a better future. But I just wanted us to kind of look at what I've been asked to speak up about, which is youth unemployment and basically unemployment in at large. But I wanted us to first look at how, historical and economic development that happens, and that already, when we start 2020, there's, a threat of a global recession. And then most of the countries are, in the global south, I can say that, they're in economic depression at the time of the start and the spreading of the pandemic. And I think it's very important that we look at where we come from in the pre-COVID-19 period and what's happening in the COVID period, and how does those two kind of, periods contribute to what we could expect or what we could try to change for the future. So basically speaking about unemployment and looking at the South African context, unemployment in this country has been increasing for the past 10 years, especially youth unemployment, uninterrupted. So there's been a quite rise of structural unemployment, whether the economy is growing, whether there is positive GDE, whether interest rates are frozen. So all those economic indicators that go down and up have shown that they don't have direct influence on structural unemployment. And I think when we enter the COVID time now, we see a huge increase in mass retrenchment and unemployment. And I think what we want to look at is what are the responses to the never-ending crisis of structural unemployment pre-COVID, and what have we done with the acceleration of mass unemployment in the COVID area, and how do those two contribute to the future? Because sometimes I think, when I thought about this title, I'm thinking it's a bit too early for us to, try to assume or try to think about a COVID-19 post-society of some sort. But I think it also then brings us to talk about how we do things now matters in how we go to the future. So I think that's very important. And I think if we have to think about structural employment, especially in the South African context, is that we haven't had kind of a macroeconomic government policy that says we're trying to deal with this issue. And I think we move into a COVID period at the same time, no one seems to say, how do we deal with unemployment? And I think most academics and most activists have come to the conclusion that the jobs are not coming. So we have to deal with that the question, and that's why there's a rise and huge debates around things like the basic income grant and the national social security fund, because we were at a position where we're saying the jobs are not coming, whether it's now in the post COVID-19 society. So we have to really think about how do we look at structural unemployment and still respond in a framework that fits the neoliberal framework of the economy. So we're basically saying that even in our response in a crisis, we still are failing to look at much more fairer, much more egalitarian kind of forms of economies that try to respond to this. And then, as I said in the beginning of 2020, when this starts, in February, the South African government, produces its budget speech. And even in that, you could see that we're in a crisis, but the response keeps on being in the linear neoliberal sense. The former finance minister starts with slashing the public sector wage bill, meaning they're cutting any possibilities of jobs in the public sector. We go there. There's huge slashes in public spending, even going to health in a time of a health crisis. So even the mitigation strategies are kind of moving back to a neoliberal austerity that reproduces unemployment. So it doesn't make sense. You kind of have, we're trying to respond to a crisis that is creating unemployment and poverty. You are reinforcing it with economic policies that reproduce the same problem that you're trying to run away from. So we have that problem, and that the reason that we won't see any change in going in the next few years is that we're trying to solve the same problems using the same economic policies, which is not working, and things are just getting worse and worse and worse, accelerated by the COVID-19 kind of pandemic, and we're still stuck in this cycle of poverty and unemployment, especially for young people. And I think we need to dare to dream and move from this framework that is still under, the neoliberal thinking of economics, and that looks at GDPs and looks at interest rates and looks at economic growth in trying to deal with structural unemployment. That has proven that it doesn't work. And we have to, other economists would like to say we have to look at the real economy and how it affects job creation. So I think that's very important. It's something that we need to think about in terms of how do we resolve the issue of unemployment in this country, which is kind of very, very reinforced. And then I think in the next few years, we're still expecting high, rates of unemployment, especially for young people of South Africa. And we need to really think about how do we shift from the economics of neoliberal austerity and to much more egalitarian forms of economics. But I just want to then move to a bit also to the contribution on education, and that the crisis of the pandemic showed us how our education sector was one of the fragile and very hardest hit by the crisis. We saw the chaos on the closing of schools, reopening of schools, reclosure of schools. And I think the film that we watched at the beginning of the festival showed some of those crises. And I think even in the education sector, instead of looking at the critical areas, curriculum development, curriculum recovery, how do we, recover from lost time and learning time, our response is always within the framework again. What the Department of Education just did is to shift dates, shift the calendar, shift the academic calendar. So you're moving with a group of young people who have missed a critical education time in especially if you look at young, early development in the earlier grades, where you need to learn those cognitive skills, those critical cognitive skills, because if you don't learn them at that time, education becomes much more difficult as you grow and become an adult. And all those young people then in the future, and even in the post COVID-19 society, will be then stuck in a life of poverty and unemployment, because they come from a time that kind of had massive loss of education time. And I mean, we saw also huge mass of learners leaving school. We've never seen such high rates of dropout rates of young people just leaving school. And no one is saying anything about that. We're just shifting dates and calendars and trying to see if the curriculum can be squeezed. But no one really wants to talk about the content of our economy and the content of how we can restructure, education outcomes when we're looking at the COVID pandemic. So I think that's, for me, will be the preliminary, contribution to say that how I view the post-COVID-19 society is made up of the pre-COVID society that we lived in and what's happening now. And I'm saying that there hasn't been any form of change or any radical shift from the economic models and economic systems set up, even in a time of crisis, even in a time of trying to respond to mass unemployment, to poverty that has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. We still insist on trying to resolve the questions of the economy using the same answers under the framework of neoliberal austerity. So that's not going to change going forward. The unemployment will continue to rise in the way it rises. And I want to emphasize before I stop speaking that the crisis of unemployment is also really, underlooked, in a sense that what we get, the unemployment stats that we get from Stats SA and other people, it's a set of averages. It never tells us the exact number of people who are unemployed at a particular time, whether the economy is growing or not. So the crisis of unemployment and youth unemployment is further than what we kind of talk about in the mainstream and the numbers that we are presented to us. So there is a continuation from the pre to the current and to the future, that there needs to be more movement to the radical economic approach outside the neoliberal sense. Thank you, Shoki.
Thank you so much, Zama. Yeah, those were all excellent reflections. So much to discuss for later. Especially appreciated your thoughts that the South African political class has this refusal to just accept that addressing the crisis of unemployment is going to require some radical policy direction, and hopefully we'll have a conversation about what that might look like in a short while. So, but before we get into that, thank you once again to Zama, and to move on to our next panelist for the evening, who's going to continue the conversation about how do we rethink a post-COVID-19 world. I think Zama's right. It might be too soon to say that we are entering such a world, but if we had the opportunity, which is I suppose what this is, to think about what we might want that world to look like, then we will specify. So to next give us an idea of what the kind of necessary re-socialization society is going to need in response to COVID, I'm happy to introduce Amuzweni Ngoma, who is a researcher in political economy at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. She's currently completing her PhD with Rose University, where she also taught research methods and the political economy of South African capitalism. She's the author of Political Conditions that Facilitate Coalition Formation and Workability, as part of Mistra's latest publication, Marriages of Convenience, which is edited by Professor Susan Boyson. She's also the author of Political Identities of South Africa's Professional Black Middle Class, which was published in the book, The Rise of Africa's Middle Class, Myths, Realities, and Critical Engagement, which is edited by Henning Malber. She has written numerous other articles on youth development, the Black middle class, professionals, elections, and social cohesion. And she's also involved in Mistra's upcoming work on youth and national development, as well as the evolution of the structure of the South African economy. I will post some links to those various publications in the chat, but now very happy to give Amuzweni the floor to make her presentation for this evening. So over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I think it might actually be good evening. I have my curtains drawn because it will be dark soon. And thank you, William. Thank you also, Zama, for a fascinating presentation. Welcome to everybody else. I'm really honored to have been invited by the Rethinking Economics for Africa to offer thought on what might be an idealistic post-COVID society. Indeed, given the lessons that we have learned from COVID-19, what idealistic future might we look forward to? Of course, this question is predicated on a hope, an aspiration that many of us hold in the world. And it is also perhaps predicated on the idea that science and medicine will offer us a cure that eradicates this pandemic, and of course, maybe other diseases too. I would argue that an idealistic post-COVID future necessarily depends on whether or not we have and are indeed learning the lessons that we need to learn from this pandemic. To hold up a mirror on whether or not we are learning the required lessons to build and rebuild a better crisis-resilient and inclusive future, we need to think back to what lessons have been derived by societies and their leaders and individuals in general from past plagues, poxes, and epidemics. And indeed, in looking at this, some of the answers are quite surprising. at least for now. In a short history of disease, plagues, poxes, and civilizations, published in 2015, Sean Martin chronicles the historical and geographical evolution of infectious and non-infectious diseases. It's a lovely, easy to access pocketbook on diseases. Sean Martin's exposition of what countries have learned from new diseases, that is, those diseases that have actually emerged in the late 1960s, is in fact very surprising. From my layperson point of view, it is interesting that the new diseases that he speaks about have a lot of similarity to the symptoms that we have actually experienced with COVID-19. And in doing so, you realize that the fact that many people have been speaking about that COVID-19 was just an epidemic in waiting might in fact be true. For example, if we think about the similarities with COVID-19, employees of a pharmaceutical giant contracted the Marburg virus in 1967 in Germany and were sick and hospitalized with flu-like symptoms. Following that is the Lassa fever of 1969 in eastern Nigeria, where the first to be infected, Laura White, a nurse, complained of a sore throat. Doctors subsequently discovered extensive damage to her organs, and in particular, the buildup of fluid and blood in her lungs. Ebola, that erupts in 1976 in the Democratic Republic of Congo, too, also has COVID-like symptoms, with people suffering from fever, sore throats, joint and muscle pain, and rapid breath. And like the COVID-19 virus, these are all zoonotic diseases. Mishra's book on epidemics and the health of African nations, published in July 2019, just a couple of months before the advent of COVID-19, defines zoonotic diseases as those diseases that result from human contact with animals. These are on the increase due to rapid urbanization, farming methods, global value chains, and indeed the quest for super profits. So in this context, can we really imagine an idealistic post-COVID society in the world? The answer from the lessons we learned from the zoonotic diseases, both from Mishra's book and Martin, is that too little is known about how they can be cured. Too little is indeed known too about how they disappear and reappear in different geographical regions, as well as at different periods, different times. Perhaps this is what prompted the former US president to think COVID-19 would indeed just simply disappear as quickly as it had appeared. But really, if we just go back to a little bit to what we really do understand, what is understood is that the global political and economic relations, also mentioned just now by Zama, are associated with how these superviruses and bugs become embedded in societies. Martin's statement actually is illustrative. He says that more than the real danger that viruses pose, politics indeed pose a bigger danger. It has been the intersection then of economic and political interests that has upheld whether or not we survive the pandemic and will hold up whether or not we get to a post-COVID society. It is important to note too that while Mishra's book argues that zoonotics are diseases of the future, it also calls for a syndemics approach in dealing with epidemics. A syndemics approach that recognizes the multiple structural drivers that actually heighten vulnerability to disease. These are, of course, identified as social, economic, environment, and political situations that are present in different societies. And in fact, the collision of these also speak about whether or not these pathogens will be super spread. Through a syndemics approach, we can understand how socioeconomic issues such as poverty and inequality, social practices, and individual preferences and proclivities contribute to the spread of disease. So, a counter-epidemic response for COVID-19 and any other impending zoonotic disease, one that moves us maybe to a post-any disease kind of society, must therefore, I definitely argue, apply a syndemics approach. And now, in this particular moment, right, can we really say that South Africa and the world indeed has taken a syndemics counter-COVID response? My answer to this is that probably not, right? And I think even the introduction that has been provided by William and the exposition provided by Zama touches on exactly the fact that we have not perhaps taken a structural view, a syndemic view as a counter-COVID response. On the social front, for example, we know that too little has been done. More than anything, the world has been worried about economic challenges presented by the pandemic. And a simple political economy analysis reveals that we have a crisis of social institutions. The family is under threat. Zama spoke about it a little bit. Statistics have been released on the increased rate of teenage pregnancy. Girls as young as 10 are getting pregnant. Families are been happening for a long time. Did I just lose connection?
We lost you for a second there, Amuzweni, but don't worry.
What was the last word?
You were talking about the crisis of social institutions and the family eroding, and I think that's about when we lost you for a second.
Apologies. So as I was saying, families evolve. Yeah, families, family units have succumbed to COVID-19, and livelihoods have been lost. So the family, as a basic unit of South African society, is under threat. It has been like this for a long time. And in our syndemics counter-COVID response, I think definitely too little is said about the family. Too little is said about the professions that support the family structure, such as social workers. In fact, social workers are the most undervalued set of professionals in South Africa. Too little is also said about the organizations that support families. Many COOs have indeed collapsed due to the COVID-19 fallout. So our COVID response has relied really way too much on money and masks, way too much on 500 billion, and way too much on 350. This is not to say that this is not needed. And now we rely a lot on vaccination within a context, very ironically, where there is significant little trust on government by the citizenry. I offer 2 points to close. There is just too little resocialization that's taking place. Like Zama said, the structure of the global economic and political relations remains led by the ostensible financialized capitalist system. There is a deep vaccine reluctance. Some people wear masks on their mouths but don't cover their noses. And like the Ebola virus, social burial rites and the risk of infection remain culturally important to many of us. And while there is a global virus, right, the experience of COVID-19 is super isolating and incredibly atomized. And on the economic front, large research engines have produced well-designed research reports, strategizing about how to make global value chains less risky and more resilient. The structure of our economic relations remains intact, meaning that we keep the intercontinental air travel, global shipping, and all the supply chains intact. This is what we're fighting for. We keep the currencies moving and being exchanged. And we also keep therein the opportunities for invasive pathogens and vectors in circulation. The big lesson, I think, is to rehumanize ourselves, to see value in the person, to see value in the individual, and the relations between that. If the value is not in the people, but the systems of exchange, then we do not have a post-COVID utopia of sorts. And I think just in closing, I am definitely closing, to Zama's point, how might we sociologically reimagine who we are and what we say about ourselves? I think that there are very tiny sporadic moments of, alternative economies that are coming up. I have a 22-year-old cousin who was fascinated by this guy that wrote Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And in Rich Dad, Poor Dad, I think this guy's name is Michael. He just keeps saying, why must you save money if it's being printed? Why must you save? You must go get yourself a lot of debt, buy something that has value, break it up, basically just financialization. And this is a link that was sent to me by my young cousin. And I just wonder, the kinds of values, right, that are being pushed out there. And also, again, if we think about ourselves and young people and alternative economies, young people have just simply been left to gereza, to panda, to hustle. Chartered accountants and engineers themselves are also hustling and pandering. This is the language of how we include ourselves in an economy. Or maybe it may be a language about how we bust open alternative avenues of exchange, of trade, of livelihood. And maybe this is where we are, and all of this is paradoxically ensconced in, another side of people, a Black middle class so hyper privileged that all they can imagine is Black excellence. And what they can imagine is being blessed and highly favored. So our this current moment and whatever post-COVID society we're moving on is wrought with contradictions. And this is just simply where we are. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Amuzweni. That was wonderful and excellent to build on a lot of the themes that Zama brought to the fore. Anecdotally, I also read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but I was much younger than 21, so I think it's forgivable that I read the book. I think it was, Robert Kiyosaki and Donald Trump who authored it, and I was maybe, in my early teens when I read this book. I'm glad I've moved past that, but I think as a little sample of where a lot of young people are at, I think you're right in saying a lot of us are misdirected, and indeed we need to overcome the sort of spirit of individualism that capitalism has instilled in all of us, and reimagine how we relate to each other, not only at an individual level, but also as countries. And I think that brings us nicely to our last panelist for the evening, who is Fatima Hassan, who's been doing a lot of campaigning and a lot of thinking about the inequalities that persist between countries. So to introduce her, Fatima is a human rights lawyer and a social justice activist and the founder of the Health Justice Initiative. She's a former executive director of the Open Society Foundation for South Africa, heading the foundation for 6 years between 2013 and 2019. She has dedicated her professional life to defending and promoting human rights in South Africa, especially in the field of HIV and AIDS, where she worked for the AIDS Law Project and also acted for the Treatment Action Campaign in many of its legal cases. So Fatima has been especially prolific over the last 2 years, so it's an honor to have her this evening. And over to you, Fatima, to close for tonight. Thanks.
Thanks so much, William, and to the fellow panelists, and thanks for the invitation. So I just wanted to show you 2 slides, and I'm hoping that will put things into perspective of where we're at. The first slide really just indicates to you by income category the current administration of vaccines by country status in the world. And so if you look at the period from January 2021 to the beginning of September, which is where we're at, you will notice the rapid increase in vaccine administration in high income countries in the first part of the year, obviously tapering off as it reaches more than 50–60% vaccination coverage in high income countries. And we'll come to the systemic and market factors that resulted in high income countries having overbought supplies, having hoarded supplies, and having such ample amounts of supplies that they can vaccinate their populations 3–4 times over. And then you look at the yellow part of this graph, which is for upper middle income countries, and the dark pink for lower middle income countries. And you won't be able to find the blue line because it's so flat, it's so minimal, it's so insignificant, because that is the amount of vaccines that have actually been administered in low-income countries in the world. It's a disgrace. It's a visual representation of vaccine apartheid, and it particularly and disproportionately affects people in Africa and in Asia and in some parts of Latin America. So if we look at the second slide, and this is all from our World in data, and this data is updated on an almost daily basis, you will look at the share of people who've received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine, because many countries are using different vaccine regimens, like in South Africa. Somebody would either get a one-dose Johnson & Johnson vaccine, or they may have to get a two-dose Pfizer vaccine. But nevertheless, this gives you a broad indication of the percentage in different parts of the world. So when we talk about high income, upper middle income, low income, and we look at the number of vaccines administered, I think this again graphically illustrates why Africa is mostly sitting at less than 3% of people in the whole of Africa having been fully vaccinated currently. If you look at parts of North America, particularly the US, parts of Europe, and particularly the United Kingdom as well, you'll see higher levels of vaccination coverage, which would also then indicate some of the more recent announcements in the last few days around the restrictions being lifted in those countries, the ability of people to travel in some parts of those countries, even though I should add that some of that is a bit checkered and a bit different from region to region, because even in countries like Australia, for example, it may have a slightly higher vaccination rate than, for example, Africa. They are still experiencing intermittent lockdowns and other forms of restrictions. So I'm just going to stop sharing the screen. Give me a second. I think that's working now. Apologize, I'm having some technical issues here, but I think you can see me now. So I think I wanted to, William, just make a few points. The first is that obviously the economy and our health outcomes are deeply interconnected, and I think this pandemic has shown that quite profoundly. And if we thought that the market was going to respond differently and our economic models or political system was going to respond differently, that I think would have been quite a naive way of thinking how the world was going to respond to this pandemic, because we've been here before and we've learned these lessons with HIV/AIDS. And we warned already in March 2020 that we should never rely on the market. We shouldn't rely on current existing models, because you won't have broad, widespread access to not just vaccines, but also to appropriate diagnostics and to treatment as well. And the two graphs that I've shown you is really to try and illustrate, like I said earlier, the state of vaccine apartheid. And when we talk about vaccine injustice and the dismal state of access, in a context where we were promised solidarity at the beginning of this pandemic, where there's been public funding, considerable amounts of public funding and public participation, including South African trial participations in those trials, where we've contributed to scientific knowledge, where within the space of the year, we're very fortunate to actually have multiple safe and effective vaccines, but that is not widely available to most people in Africa and parts of Asia and Latin America. And so the access rate and the vaccination rate in parts of the world currently, particularly where there are Black and brown people, is no accident. It's exactly what we thought would happen, that we would be last in line. And I would say it's actually by sinister design, because rich countries and pharmaceutical companies knew exactly what was going to happen, what they were going to do. We were told to rely on COVAX, we were told to rely on charity, we were told to rely on the market, and none of those things have actually served us. In a context where you have safe and effective vaccines, but you have a virus that is mutating fast, multiple variants emerging, where the countries with high rates of vaccination coverage are now talking about third shots. I've shown you the graphs of what's happening in Africa and parts of Asia and Latin America. The countries that are dark blue and deep blue want to now administer third shots before healthcare workers and people who are over 70 or 80 years old, or people with comorbidities in Africa, have even received their first shot. That is just scandalous in my view. And, you know, when I say that we shouldn't be surprised, or we were, anybody who thought that it would be different was naive, is we have to look at, well, how did we get here? We relied on a market that we know has never served, our interests before, whether it's on HIV, whether it's on TB, whether it's on cancer medications or treatments. But we allowed in this pandemic to continue to give monopolies power, to give private pharmaceutical corporations so much power, even though we funded their research, even though we're giving them indemnities on any liabilities, even though we are not allowed to impose export restrictions, as has been disclosed in the New York Times story in relation to the South African contract with Johnson & Johnson, with the net result that vaccines that were being filled and finished here in South Africa, in the time when we were facing wave 3, when we really needed vaccines, were being exported to Europe. 32 million vaccines have been exported from Aspen and Johnson & Johnson to Europe so that they could get to a point of dark blue and deep blue. And I think that's the travesty of the injustice that we're dealing with, that we basically gave power to private corporations and monopolies, and we refused to deal with the monopoly power. We were hoping for a waiver. We were hoping for voluntary agreements. We were hoping that they would realize that it's in their self-interest to help the rest of the world, but they haven't, right? There hasn't been broad-based technology transfer. There hasn't been multiple full manufacturing licenses. The drip feed of licenses have really been about fill and finish to BioVac and Aspen in South Africa. And other companies in Africa have actually been excluded from those agreements. So, coming to the last part of my very short presentation, when we say, how do we imagine a post-COVID society? Well, I'm sorry, but the experts that we're speaking to saying that's not going to happen anytime soon. You're going to have to live with COVID and all the imperfections of this incredibly unfair market system. You talk about capitalism, but really this is the reality. However you want to define this market is not one that is pro-poor. The market system, monopoly power with unfettered, rights, without any kind of ways and means in which you can actually claw back on that power. Even if our government was to take action against Johnson & Johnson tomorrow, the US government would immediately basically impose other forms of trade sanctions and pressure. And we've been through this with HIV/AIDS before. When a government decides to take on pharmaceutical power, you will either be sued by the pharmaceutical companies or you'll be put on trade watch lists. So the way in which the market, the economy, monopolies, the role of pharmaceutical company CEOs and them intersect to basically undermine our constitutional rights to access to healthcare, I think has been so exposed in this pandemic and is so obvious for everyone to see. And obviously we're going to have to do a lot of work to try and reform that system. But if we are going to get out of this pandemic or try and live with this pandemic in a way where there isn't that much of death and that much of illness, morbidity and mortality, we have to accelerate coverage. We have to sort out why Africa cannot manufacture its own vaccines, why it's still importing 99% of all vaccines that it uses, even in the COVID scenario. And we've got to sort out more equitable access. If we're going to get to a point where the post-COVID, whenever that may be, it could be 5 or 10 years, society is going to be one that's more equal, that is more just, that is more fair, that deals with issues around intersectionality, then one has to do all the work now to say, given what has happened in this past year and the way in which COVID has played out, and we've given so much power to the market, to the private sector, to pharmaceutical companies, how are we going to claw that back with NHI? How are we going to ensure universal health coverage if this is the reality in the middle of a pandemic? How are we going to ensure intellectual property law reforms? We have a patent law amendment that has been sitting in Parliament for at least 2 years. In a pandemic, the ruling party could not get its act together to table that legislation, which would have had all of South Africa behind it. But it can't pass that law because there is so much opposition from the market, from the private sector, from opposition parties to claw back on intellectual property protections, which basically give companies unfettered monopolies that extend to 20, 30 years, where they can charge any price, where they can ask for full indemnifications, where they can ask for export waivers, basically where they say, sign the contract or else you won't get the vaccines, and agree to all of the terms and conditions we have, which is obviously the reason why we're asking for the disclosure of all contracts. So I think what we've seen, William, just to end, is that with COVID, we've seen the weaknesses, not just in South Africa's, matrix and system, but I think in all of Africa, as well as in parts of the global South, that if we don't address this very pernicious form of monopoly protection, where it intersects with law, with trade rules, with competition rules, with the economy, then we're not going to achieve health justice. And if people thought that there wasn't a connection between markets and health equity, then I think just refreshing, sort of your memory by looking at that first and second graph again tells you exactly why they are so deeply interconnected, why we'll never get to a post-COVID society, because it's going to take years before Africa can even reach 50% vaccination coverage like many other parts of the world. And the result is our economies are going to be closed off, our movement is going to be closed off, and our health outcomes are definitely going to suffer. Maybe in the Q&A we can talk about the licenses to Aspen and BioVac. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Fatima. It's a very bleak picture that you paint, a bleak picture that everyone is painting, some glimmers of hope, of course, and I suppose the answers to how we can overcome with this rests with us and taking action. So thank you to all of our presenters, to Zama, to Amuzweni, as well as to Fatima. We are fortunately now at the Q&A section of this evening's session, and I hope everyone's come prepared with questions. There are already some questions in the Q&A function, and feel free to add more questions there, as well as if you would like to ask a question directly because you'd prefer to articulate it via speech, you're welcome to raise your hand and I will give you the power to speak. And a reminder that if you do have the microphone, please be respectful, try to keep it brief, as well as giving everyone else an opportunity to speak. But before we go to the Q&A, a reminder to keep tweeting and Facebooking and Instagramming and WhatsApping and keep a buzz going on social media. It's the final day of the festival, but we want these conversations to continue. So keep up with Rethinking Economics, as well as Rethinking Economics for Africa, so that we keep the conversations alive and going. So I'm going to bring all of the panelists to view, just so that we can get going with the Q&A section. And thanks again to everyone, of course. Yeah, that was brilliant. And I suppose I'm going to get the Q&A going by asking a question myself, abusing my my privilege as a moderator. What I thought was very interesting about a lot of the presentations that you all made is a recurring thread was about the constraints that states face given the structure of political economy internationally. So speaking about neoliberalism, monopoly power, the power of transnational capital, and all of these forces that prevent governments from governing. And so in South Africa, as you were discussing, Fatima, the South African government is hamstrung to take any action to challenge big pharma, even if it wanted to, because it would face a tremendous backlash from international finance capital. We can't stimulate job creation because the amount of jobs that we can create depends on market forces outside of our control. So I'm interested to hear from everyone when we're thinking about how to create this post-COVID future, what hope is there for us to try and make those efforts at a domestic level? Because it does feel like, and this pandemic feels testament to that a lot of the powers that influence the way we can do anything are out of our control. So how do we orient ourselves given the realities of capital and transnational capital and market monopolies having power and vested interests that they want to protect? I'll let anyone have a crack at that. Fatima, maybe you could tell us about some of the work that you've been doing to challenge big pharma.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think it's going to be left to civil society and an independent media, because we have a ruling party that is so occupied with its own succession battles. And I mean, you all know the situation of what has happened in South Africa in the last few weeks. Today, we found out that an acting DG of health has been appointed because the current DG has been, we believe, suspended, also linked to the reasons why the former Minister of Health was basically suspended and then asked to resign or resigned on his own. One is not sure. But we've had like multiple changes in 1 year in the middle of a pandemic in relation to our health system. So I don't think the National Department of Health and government is totally fully occupied with dealing with all the different elements that it has at its disposal, including our constitution, to challenge pharmaceutical power. And this works well in the market's favor. To have so much of chaos and so much of disequilibrium in relation to the ruling party basically means that the market can get away with what it can. I mean, you also the New York Times article of 2 weeks ago, where they managed to get a copy of the contract between Johnson & Johnson and the South African government. And so you're right, on the one hand, there is this basic threat of, if you don't sign the contract in the way in which we tell you to, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson tells the South African government, then we won't give you vaccines. But could government have actually acted differently? Could it have taken action like it did during, the early years of the HIV/AIDS epidemic? Yes, the pharmaceutical industry sued Mandela in response, but that's when you bring the whole country along with you. And so there were all these measures that the South African government could have taken by declaring disaster after disaster after disaster. And it chose not to use any of the measures. It decided to just focus on the TRIPS waiver, where you're asking for 1 year for a waiver of the applicability of the WTO framework in relation to all medical technologies for COVID-19. So, I mean, totally mindful of how much power the pharmaceutical industry does actually exercise, more profitable than oil and gas in the world. But could our government have done more? I certainly think so. And not just in relation to vaccines, right? In relation to all the issues that Zama and Amuzweni have been talking about in relation to socio-economic support, in relation to social relief, in relation to issues around brutality, violence, a range of issues, a basic income grant. How is it that we, in the middle of this pandemic, and we still don't have a universal basic income grant is just like unbelievable to me.
That leads on very nicely to a question raised by an audience member. Salim is posing a question to Zama specifically and basically says that we're operating with the assumption that we don't have the right theory, and we're talking about neoliberalism as being this constraining power, but asks, what about capacity? What do we think about capacity? And Fatima, a lot of the questions that you raised just now have to do with the state's capacity, about whether or not it actually has the ability to deliver on any of these things. So Zama, do you have any thoughts about how the pandemic has basically been a testament to just how undercut the state's capacity to achieve anything has been?
No, thank you, William. Thanks for the question. I think to look at what the response of the South African government has been in relation to the crisis is basically, they've taken positions to not take responsibility. So they've kind of let the capital lead the recovery process and how do we respond to the COVID crisis. So what they do is don't run any kind of public health campaign. We still wash soapies in the pandemic. They don't, they don't change financial monetary policy. They don't spend the fiscal. They don't, it's basically saying we're not gonna put any efforts to try and mitigate the struggle. Yeah, we'll give you the 350s there, but we'll never, we'll discuss whether we make them permanent. And I mean, these are the same kind of, tricks and cultures that are there, looking at the green paper that was released around social security, then it's taken back. So it's been the same struggle we've been having, that I don't know if we're afraid or not. And this is the same thing that we've been discussing the NHI so much for so many years. And everyone in the general public, agrees that it's a progressive document. Everyone kind of says we could look at a public, health system that is accommodative and has some, financing that helps the poor of the poorest. But it seems that we always want to push state responsibilities to capital. And we know what capital wants. Says it looks at the proposals and says, is this, driving profits? Is this doing this for me? It's not. Then the state kind of goes back and says, we can't do this, we can't spend, we're in debt, and all kind of excuses that are given to us instead of actually being bold as a state and saying we're implementing the NHI, we're looking into the basic income grant as something we can put in place. So we need to really push the South African government in making commitments to economic change, because at this time it really is driven by capital.
That's fascinating. I mean, Amuzweni, that's something that I think is a big sort of line of thought in your work. This kind of social question and how the state is constantly outsourcing its responsibilities and obligations to capital, and that has a devastating effect on the basic institutions of society. I mean, at this stage, do you think there is still a chance for the state to try and reclaim some of those functions and responsibilities, or is that something that is starting to look beyond the moment?
Yeah, thanks, William. I think as human beings, the only thing that we have going for us is hope and aspiration, right? So as scholars and thinkers, we're always called upon to do meticulous analysis, right, and really look deep in. And I do think that in the current conjuncture, we do have a very fractured kind of like system, right? So we've got a fractured system in terms of organizations, right? I remember reading a piece, I think by, I might be wrong, by Jonathan Hislop, who was talking about how young Afrikaners, right, young poor Afrikaners felt at the turn of democracy, right, in 1994. Right? And he says that what you had was a situation where there were some that were extremely fearful of the impending democratic order, right? And wanted to rise up against it, but had been so disillusioned, so fractured, so unorganized that they could not do anything. And I'm constantly thinking about that, because I think about it also in relation to just the status of just general South Africans, that we are unhappy with our current social order, right? But at the same time, we are so fractured, so disorganized, so burdened that we are not actually able to come together and work it out, right? So I think that we're in a difficult space, right? And I also then think that this also relates to what we might think about as a crisis of ideas, right? Not ideology, right? but we have an ideational crisis in the sense that if you look at the National Development Plan and you look at other subsequent plans that might be guiding us socially, right? We have long lists of what we really want. We don't have a set of super ideas that we must all cohere around, right? Whether it's the market, private sector, right, draws its profits from us. It has a social responsibility, right? They're not doing anybody a favor, right? The market, in terms of carrying out such certain functions, it's not doing anybody a favor. It's required, right? It draws profits and income from society. It's not separate. It's embedded within, and we need to just simply, disabuse ourselves of that kind of notion. Yeah, private sector that's doing us or doing the state a favor. And then you have also political parties that are just so tired, they die, right? So that if you're part of a political party, yeah, DA or the ANC or whoever, you follow whatever that faction follows in government as well, so that you can actually make the life of service delivery, of policy implementation very difficult, because policy is attached to a personality that does not belong to your faction. Right? So we have a crisis of ideas. We have a crisis that we just can't simply cohere on what we really need to do. And this is what it is. Having said that, I think the big question is also then about what next? And I don't necessarily like to hear this by somebody like a president saying it or somebody saying it, but we are resilient. We are capable of building ourselves out of a crisis. We are a resilient people. That's just what it is. This is who we are, right? Not for use as a rhetoric, as a sound bite, as a political moment or whatever, right? So that even people that right? That's resilience. But it's coming out of the system that's excluded them, but these people will survive. They will make it, right? And it's that resilience of the human spirit, and this is what I mean by rehumanizing ourselves. Right? This is really what I really mean about valorizing, the battle, not battle, right? And I think that if we cohere around small, big idea, it's a small but big idea around that, who knows where we might land up.
Brilliant insights. You asked the question of where to next. I'm going to give an opportunity to Salim from the audience to ask a question. Hopefully they have an answer of where to next, no pressure. But Salim, I'm giving you an opportunity to speak. You may go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks, William. Okay, I would have sort of written it, but let me just give me a couple of minutes to gather my thoughts. I've been waiting so long. Okay, I mean, it starts off with the issue that I raised with Zama about capacity, capability, and the issue of theory. And I think, sometimes I'm often struck by the behemoth in the room dealing with the issue of COVID. I'm surprised at how surprised people are about how we're dealing with it, or the fact that we're not dealing with it the way in which we need to deal with it. We just cannot behave ourselves out of what we've acted ourselves into all of these years. We lost the battle in '94 with individualism, with Milton Friedman, and buying the whole story about what democracy, or a notion of democracy, I have to be very clear about it. A notion of democracy has allowed ourselves. I mean, this is like almost tying our hands and legs and saying, deal with the problem. I mean, COVID is not new. We've had a lingering socio-economic issue around jobs that we ought to have sorted out years ago. And we ought to have sort of highlighted as, emergency number one. We didn't. We're now sitting on 40%, and we're probably going to go on to 60%. So, I'm not offering a solution, but as long as we don't have, we've not correctly identified the problem, we're going to get nowhere. And I must thank Zama, Fatima, Amuzweni, I mean, for those insights. And Amuzweni, yes, we don't cohere, we can't cohere because of a notion of freedom that we have. Now, I've been in China for the last few years, and yes, there's lots of issues around, the notion of freedom and that kind of stuff that goes on there. But we see, okay, I mean, I know there's issues around how much of information comes out, but we see how well they've handled the pandemic post-Wuhan. There are lessons out there. We're just not listening to those kind of lessons. And it has to be about a new post-neoliberal order that begins to start thinking about, not about me, but about us. And the whole issue of vaccine hesitancy, we haven't spoken about, but it feeds into the individualism that we've just sort of crafted all these years. William, I know you said we need to be respectful and not take the stage, but I think that needed to be said. We just can't, as I said, I don't think we can't behave ourselves out of what we've acted ourselves into. And I mean, this is pre-94 as well. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Salim, for those reflections. I think of some very astute ones there. Salim says, we can't overcome our attachment to a notion of freedom that emphasizes the individual, amongst other things. Zama, you want to respond to that? You're on mute.
Yeah. No, I wanted to speak on, because generally we are always scared off by, economic rules, or this is how the economy functions, and how we are taught economics at school, and we're always like, muted because we were told that this is how global economies work and things like that. But I wanted to emphasize, I'm inspired by the previous contribution to say that economics, and much more broadly political economy, is a set of social relations. It's not something in the textbook that says it will go to this direction, it will go to this direction forever. That in societies, there's different groups, there's powerful groups, there's less powerful groups, and all these groups interact and have social relations based on their different interests. And capital wants to, maximize profit. The people want to socialize and be able to live basic, lives, and all these interests sometimes intersect and are in contradiction. And that there must never be a sense of that things can't be done, that things can be changed. And one of the lessons that we learn from the COVID pandemic is, especially in other countries, is that we saw countries taking out stimulus packages and supporting people. We saw people, rent freezes happening where the state assists people. We've seen the 350s getting out, and those are social relations. And we're always muted by, the economics, academic things that are not really important. This is about different groups and societies, fighting it out for their different interests. And that for us to move to a much more fairer, egalitarian society, this lies primarily on civil societies and its movements. And that the state itself is dominated or takes decisions based on the movements between the powerful groups and the weaker groups. And that we see states taking in demands from below when the movements from below and the community organizations from below take it to the state and demand that things are there. So I think one of the difficult things that we haven't seen in South Africa is that civil society has weakened over the years, and the state is able to take decisions and there's no response, and kind of continues to do what they, as you say, the fact that unemployment has been increasing uninterrupted for the past 10 years and with no government macroeconomic response, that's crazy. But the government won't just wake up and say, oh, we see the crisis, we will respond. You know, it needs to be pushed. We have a crisis now of school dropouts. Learners are just leaving school in thousands and thousands and thousands in a short period of time. The state is busy around changing the school calendar. No one seems to say, we need to address the fact that the learners are leaving school, and those learners are now stuck in the life of poverty and unemployment. And that's why we have so much high youth unemployment in this country. So these social relations are not stagnant and are not, you know, pre-assumed. It's the different groups in society fighting it out for different interests. So it's important that if we want more egalitarian societies, we must speak about how is civil society pushing government as well, because government will be dominated by the group that presents pressure on it.
I think you pose a very, very important question there about thinking about how civil society is pushing back, and everyone reflected earlier about the level of organization of social movements and social forces. And I want to connect that with a question that Kholagano raises in the Q&A, which asks, has COVID made the Afrocentric economic system seem further away? And maybe sort of rephrasing that slightly and thinking about, you know, continental solidarity and about, you know, the once really strong history of Pan-Africanism that we once had, when I think, Amuzweni, you're talking about how we're suffering from a crisis of ideation. We once lived in a period where across the continent, there were these visionary ideas for how society could be organized differently and organized against the interests of the West and uniting the third world, I suppose, which is a term that's out of fashion now, in a stance that emphasizes collaboration, cooperation, and solidarity at that level. And to link it to what Kholagano asks, we don't really seem to see much of that anymore. And considering the fact that the continent is, as you were portraying for us, Fatima, is going to be bearing the greatest burden of this virus. It's going to take us years to reach 50% vaccination, as you said. How come we haven't seen much of a fight back, and a fight back that calls on that spirit of fighting that we once demonstrated in the 20th century?
Do you want me to
Go
just
ahead.
tell you? So it's apt we're talking about civil society activism and what we can do to change things. And something has just happened in the last few minutes, which I think is really important. So earlier I was telling you about the Johnson & Johnson contract, which the South African government was forced to sign and give Johnson & Johnson an unlimited right to export vaccines out of South Africa from Aspen, with the one license it got to Europe. The news is just in that because of our pressure, because of our work to tell that story with investigative journalists, we've been working on this relentlessly for months around transparency and to tell the world that this is what was happening. While Africa has less than 3% of people vaccinated, the AU has just announced that they've got an agreement with Johnson & Johnson after President Ramaphosa and the AU have stepped in and have basically said all the exports have to be halted. So instead of those vaccines going to Europe, they have to go to the rest of Africa. And they claim, and we will watch that and we will make sure there's oversight, because I do not believe anything that anybody says in this pandemic. There has to be oversight and accountability, that they claim that the vaccines that have been sent will be sent back. Now that's a bit questionable, because maybe they have extra doses, or maybe they're hoarded, or maybe they're sending us the stuff that's about to expire. But be that as it may, there is an undertaking now that Africa will get at least a couple of million more vaccines than they currently have in the system by next week from Johnson & Johnson, because we put pressure on that contract. Not the South African government, civil society, and an independent media. Now, you can say what you want about Johnson & Johnson and the vaccine, but the point is we need to get people vaccinated. And yes, we do need to deal with vaccine hesitancy, but I think that's a ruse. The surveys that we've done, the experts we've spoken to, most Black and brown communities realize the importance of a vaccine, realize that it's safe, realize that they want to take it and need to take it, but the systemic obstacles there around lack of transport, about vaccine sites being too far, about having an electronic system in a country where most people don't have a smartphone and know how to make an appointment. I mean, I couldn't even figure out the system, right? And I have 3 degrees and I couldn't figure out why I'm not getting an SMS, and should I wait for the SMS, or should I walk in, or should I go down the road? Or, you know, and I live next to a vaccine site and they sent me somewhere else. So can you imagine what people whose language is not, first language is not English, are actually having to go through? But I want to come back to this issue of Ramaphosa and the AU and whoever else stepping in to stop the exports. How did they not know? The exports were leaving our shores, were leaving our ports in the middle of a pandemic. How did they not know? And secondly, how did we as South Africa, it's great and wonderful that everybody over 18 is getting a vaccine. We know that we have neighboring countries in Africa with no vaccines for healthcare workers and people over 60. And we kept supplies to open it up to everybody over 18. So we have also been complicit in this form of vaccine nationalism, because we didn't do enough to get supplies to the rest of Africa. We may be taking measures now, but it's September 2021. It's 1 year too late. We could have been in a very different situation in Africa. Yes, Amuzweni is right. It's not just about vaccines. It's also about masking and social distancing. But we could have gotten to a point of some sense of normality much sooner, by April, May, June already, like Europe did, if we actually had a real commitment to deal with the market, tackle monopoly power, say to the pharmaceutical companies, you are not elected. You account to nobody. Nobody is supposed to have given you so much of power, and we should have actually clawed back. I mean, to do that now in September is very late, right? I mean, this, I mean, you know, I just can't believe that it's been so late. And then just finally, William, why the physical outpouring of outrage? It's because it's a pandemic. This is not like the HIV/AIDS pandemic where you can do door-to-door, where you can have protests. We've been in repeat lockdowns with changing regulations. A lot of governments in Africa have used the lockdowns for authoritarian reasons and measures. So it has not been easy for civil society to physically congregate and mobilize and organize. And that is why all of the ways in which we've organized historically has been, you know, put into question and under the spotlight. And how we do this virtually going forward, I think is going to be the real difficulty. So I'm just really pleased, because I can't believe we've worked in this for months and we've halted those exports. And that's what we need to do on every other contract as well. We need those contracts to be disclosed, and we need those contracts to be amended. And the countries that have excess supplies need to start diverting immediately.
Congratulations, first of all, to you and everyone that's worked so hard on this. It's nice to hear the news in this forum as we are having this conversation. And I suppose it's also testament to what Zama was saying, which is that it's not like nothing can be done. As you've said, there are a lot of obstacles to doing something. But I suppose when we mobilize and when we apply pressure, we can make the changes, and we're not completely powerless. So I want to give one more opportunity for someone to ask a question to Sekutlane, who's had their hand up for a while. So I'll give Sekutlane the opportunity to ask a question, which I think will be the final question, and then we'll wrap up. If you can unmute, there we go. Sekutlane, can you hear us and can you speak?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Can you hear me? Lovely. Well, thank you, William, and thank you to your incredible speakers on the panel this evening. So my question's in 2 parts, really. The first is, clearly, you know, we need a new social compact. And I've been thinking and working and engaging around this new social compact that is organized around principles of compassion, integrity, and most importantly, accountability. But the question I really have here is, you know, where should the locus of that new social compact reside, given what is happening within how our state is organized at the moment, given the fragmentation that you've spoken about so wonderfully, Amuzweni, given the fact that civil society itself is so fragmented and so substantially weakened. So, who should be engineering this new social compact? Where should that power come from? How should it be mobilized? Linked to that is the question around the emergence of authoritarianism in our modes of governance, especially that has been especially accelerated through the emergency measures that COVID has called for, at least. And this authoritarianism, for me, seems or appears to follow direction of the state as an enforcer of private monopoly interests, rather than an enforcer and securer of public interests and public goods. And this is happening not just internally within our state, but also just in terms of what the global economy has set up, because it is a globalized world economy, and it is focused on growth more than anything else, and financialization, as you said so well before. So, how do we tackle these things? And I'm inspired by what Fatima has been saying so far, just around the work that's happened around the vaccine specifically. But of course, the vaccine is not the only solution. And in fact, this vaccine could perhaps not be the solution at all, given the asymmetries of power and access that are happening between the global north and the south, and the issues around how knowledge and trade is organized in the globalized economy. So I'm really interested in kind of getting your sense of how should we go about and think through this new social compact that we need, and where it should be engineered from and how. Thank you.
Brilliant question, Sekutlana. I think gives us a good way to wrap up the discussion when we're thinking about this post-COVID-19 society. So one, where and how is the new social compact that we need going to come from? And two, how do we guard against the rising threat of authoritarianism? The conditions for that have been created by the pandemic. How do we create something that avoids that through the social compact? So perhaps to get all of our final thoughts, Amuzweni, if you maybe want to kick us off and tell us what you think.
Yeah, no. I have to think in leaps and bounds here, Fatima, congratulations to you and your team and the organization. We must recognize that this is a great feat, and that and also like what you said about the potential for reversal in the importance of oversight there. Look, social compacting is probably, I would say, also working as a researcher at MISTRA, probably one of the mechanisms, right? Very long-term mechanisms that we actually work ourselves out and navigate ourselves out of the multiple, ecological crises that we face, right? We must also then like implicit in my presentation was the idea that, we are going to be living perhaps in a society full of pathogens, and that capitalism itself is a pathogen, right? The first speaker to raise his hand and ask a question, right, made a point that is extremely important, right? The hyper individualization of interest. So personal interest is everything for all of us, really, right? And this is because we've been forced to survive in this way. If I'm going to prefer an idea, I think there was a good policy on the table in the early 1990s that spoke about national youth service, right? And it was like national youth co-ops and getting young people to serve, learn, participate, be engaged in that kind of thing. And when Zama speaks about, an ever increasing rate of unemployment, he also doesn't speak about an ever increasing level of disengagement, right? So if you're not only are people employed, people are not in school, like he says, people are not in training and education, right? And we don't know if we don't actually know where they are, right? But I think that a social compact must be mobilized around our initial thoughts on national youth service, with service as the core, service from anybody, a political person, a non-political person, a minister, whatever, and not to politicize the idea of service, right? Not to politicize the idea of service. If we can all cohere around the idea of service from an institutional perspective, from an individual perspective, from a professional perspective, and so on, I think we might actually just be able to start to navigate, like I say, through this thing. We must, I think, return to elements of that green paper, National Youth Service, that the state just absolutely refused, like it refused with the RDP to implement, right? And there were good ideas of service, of development in there. So I think a social compact based on cohering around playing my part, like e-service, might actually be something that we're able to galvanize and cohere around. Thanks.
Thank you, Amuzweni. Zama, concluding thoughts, especially this idea of service and mobilizing young people in particular to play their part?
Yeah, no, I think just a final comment is that what I said before is that we cannot force things that are no longer working. South Africans, more and more South Africans are living in, far more worse conditions. And there's no us, there's no national unity, there's no kumbaya. This thing is about us together. The poor majority is out in the streets and saying we're hungry. We saw with the recent unrest and the food riots, even in that sense, we keep on calling them thugs, looters, instigators. There's a clear breaking of the social compact, as the last, the question was there, and that you have certain groups and societies that have their own interest, and they look at the poor majority with contempt. They look at the poor majority with, with disgust, and they try to simplify the issues. And that even though COVID is a health crisis, it is also a social crisis in South Africa, where South Africa continues to show that the poor majority is not, taken seriously. The poor majority is also now starting to seek its own ways in finding ways to survive. And the state is becoming less and less influential. Parliament is losing its prestige. As you say, then we move to a politics of authoritarianism that kind of seems to the powerful groups just dominating, all forms and sectors of society. And my solution is still there, that it lies in the primacy of civil society and civil society organizations and mobilizations and organizations that continue to poke, the example that we just had now, that shows that we need to get to this contract. There's so much shady things that happens in this country, so much corruption that happens in this country. Digital vibes, to me, it's still like, how did this happen in a pandemic? In a goddamn pandemic, money is just flares in our faces like that. And when people start, accepting that this is a society that we live in, that has no morals, that has no social contract, that has no agreements amongst its people, it only becomes worse and worse. And as I said, we expect more of this rise of violence. We expect more of rise of disunity, of poverty, of high unemployment, gender-based violence, all those things that are created and produced and reproduced by the neoliberal framework becomes worse and worse and worse. So there needs we must first move away from the kumbaya, we're in this together. We're not in this together. Sharp.
Thank you, Zama. And indeed, civil society is primary. So Fatima, you have the final word. As everyone has acknowledged, we've just had a small victory. It's gotten me feeling a lot more hopeful, but alas, there's still a lot of work to do. What do you think are the big battles ahead?
So, I mean, I agree with everything that Zama and Amuzweni have said, but if we just look at South Africa, we've got like so many problems. We've got a weak executive and a weak parliament, as Zama have said. I mean, it's really just been absent in this pandemic. We've got a hunger problem, a food security problem, unemployment, health inequity and access problems and health burdens, not just COVID, HIV, TB, cancer, a whole range of diseases. sanitation problem, education problem, and a growing corruption problem where people think that the state is a bottomless pit of money, right? That is what the whistleblower who was assassinated, one of her last statements was that every few years, a group of people come into the provincial government and they think it's a bottomless pit of money and they come to steal. And that is what we're dealing with. And it's not just on the side of government, it's also to be found in the private sector. So we've got a double-sided corruption problem. It's very difficult to deal with one part because it takes two to actually enable those high levels of corruption. And then we have a housing and land crisis. So Sekotlane always asks difficult questions, and so good to hear you and see you, Sekotlane. But I don't know how we create a social compact out of this, you know, in a context of this kumbaya version of a constitutional democracy. It's the only thing we kind of have on our side. We have a few rights that are contained in the Constitution. We have a somewhat strong civil society, and at least for now, a fairly strong and independent media that can still tell you the story about digital vibes. But we're in a perilous state. People are scared of exposing and blowing the whistle because of what has been happening. So how we build that social cohesion that you've been talking about, Amuzweni, and how we get that social compact that Sekotlane is talking about, I don't know. I've been doing this work for 25 years, and this is the bleakest I've ever been. And I thought it would be different in this pandemic because they all said, this is the pandemic where people realize we're all interconnected and there'll be solidarity and, you know, but we've seen the worst of human behavior and corporate behavior in this pandemic. So keep on doing the good work.
Keep on doing the good work indeed. I mean, I suppose it's another reminder to have a pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will. And once again, thank you so much to our fantastic speakers this evening who've helped us get some way ahead of thinking through what this new social compact looks like, what this new society looks like, or at least inspiring us to do the work to try and get there. But a reminder that it doesn't end here. REFA is just one small contribution to us thinking through the world ahead and the challenge ahead. So a reminder to everyone to have a look at the chat where Amara has posted links for you to keep on following REFA, to keep the conversation going, to give your feedback. Hopefully these conversations will lead to something. That's always the intention of bringing people together in the same room to discuss and to try and find these big ideas or these small ideas, as Amuzweni was saying, and I definitely feel enriched by the contributions that all of you have made tonight. So deepest gratitude on behalf of Rethinking Economics for Africa, deepest gratitude to our attendees who asked some brilliant questions, and hopefully we will all meet again, and in those circumstances, things will be less bleak and we will be some way to trying to build back better. So thank you to everyone, and we will see you around, and until then, stay safe and as cheerful as you can. Good evening.
Thank you, William.
Thank you, William. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Fatima and Zama.
Thank you both. Bye.
Bye-bye.